Welcome to this episode of Spotlight On, a series of interviews brought to you by Overdeck Family Foundation. Here we sit down with the nonprofit leaders shaping the future of education and talk to them about innovation, evidence, and growth. My name is Jessica Fredston-Hermann, and I'll be your host for today's Spotlight on Innovation. The concept of strategic staffing in classrooms has recently gained more attention as education leaders seek new ways to improve student learning experiences and working conditions for teachers. The promise is compelling. By strategically allocating personnel and resources, schools can create more inclusive, supportive, and effective learning environments. In this discussion, we'll delve into the current practices of classroom staffing, explore the potential benefits of adopting strategic staffing approaches, and identify some of the barriers and challenges that can arise in implementation. Joining me is David Rosenberg, a partner at Education Resource Strategies, which partners with school leaders to help them make transformative shifts in their resources, structures, and practices to improve schools for teachers and students. Since Education Resource Strategies was founded, approximately 6 million students across 120 districts have benefited from its work to improve the teaching profession. It's great to see you, David.
Jessica, it's great to be here. Thanks.
So to get us started today, could you describe how classrooms are currently staffed in schools across the country?
For sure. And it's funny to be asked the question even to start, because part of the challenge is that everybody kind of knows because it hasn't changed in so long, right? So the classroom that your child is in is not that different from the classroom that you were in, is not that different from the classroom that your parents were in or your grandparents, right? So what does school look like today? Most of school still happens with one adult and 20 or 25 or 30 or sometimes 35 kids in a room. And for a prescribed period of time in which there's a set of learning happening. Often that's still the teacher's sort of sage on the stage style. But we've made a lot of progress in the field about trying to make learning more student-driven, ideally. But generally speaking, the way school works today is not that different from the way it's worked for years and years and years.
Yeah, that resonates. That reminds me of the one teacher, one classroom model that I've taught in, that I've taken classes in. So I referenced the phrase strategic staffing earlier. What does that mean to you? What does that actually look like to do staffing differently than this one teacher, one classroom model?
Yeah, so strategic staffing is a phrase that kind of captures several different aspects of what teaching could be and what that student experience therefore could be. So some key attributes of a strategic staffing model. Ideally, you have diverse groups of educators who are sharing work, right? So teaching right now is a very isolated, sort of rigid profession. You do most of that work, as you said, as one teacher in one classroom. And so in a strategic staffing model, the work of educating kids is shared. The work of teaching and planning and managing student and family relationships is shared among a team of educators. The roles of those educators would vary by design, and they would change over the course of your career. There's not a lot of careers out there where the job you have on day one is the same as the job you'd have in year 10 or year 30 even. And teaching still is, for many people, that. A third attribute that marks strategic staffing approaches is time for both educators and students is intentionally organized in ways that allow for collaboration and for differentiation of instruction, and there's real support for implementing high quality curriculum, instructional materials, and assessments, right? And so teachers are not left to their own devices to figure out how they do it. And time is not just saying, well, we have these X minute periods to go. It's actually much more thoughtfully done in ways that allow for that sharing of work and of instruction. And then the last piece that you would see and experience as an educator is you'd have fewer administrative burdens, right? More time for instruction, more time for student support, for planning, for professional growth. And so if those things are going to be true, it means some other things have to change, right? So we need to think about how we pay teachers. We need to think about what career paths look like. We need to think about the policy, the resource use decisions that make the current system what it is. And in an ideal world, we actually have educators shaping the decisions about how it is that they engage with students and invest their time. It is not solely driven by somebody on the outside saying, here's how it works, but that there's some agency involved to ensure that that we bring the best of the things that we know work in the field with the best of what individual educators can bring to their communities.
You mentioned a lot of potential benefits for implementing strategic staffing in classrooms, some for teachers, some for students. Could you talk through what are some of the other benefits that you think of that will help improve the teaching and learning experience, both for that teacher development trajectory that you referenced, as well as you sort of touched on differentiation for students, but would love to hear a little bit more about how this impacts teachers and students.
Sure. So if we do this work well, if we build teaching to be the kind of profession we want it to be and have the impact we want on students, then teaching becomes significantly more attractive, it's more sustainable, and it's more consistently excellent, right? And so part of what I hear in your question, Jessica, is looking at what it actually changes for students. And so a big part of this is time to plan, to immerse yourself in curriculum, and to do so with colleagues who can engage in the intellectual work and wrestling with how is it that we translate the curriculum into powerful lessons that engage students and really help move them forward. So that's about time. That's also about access to expertise, right? Not every educator is going to be expert in every aspect of what they're being asked to teach, and certainly not early in their career. So how do we leverage the experience of the most experienced educators so that it's not like, oh, well, Ms. Fredston-Hermann down the hall has been doing this for a while. I'm going to try to catch her after school. It becomes like we are actually working together directly. And the other piece I would say is in doing this work together, more students have access to more educators. And so somebody was telling this story, a colleague recently, about and I've had this for my own kids, if my kid gets assigned to the wrong teacher, just either it's because not a particularly effective teacher, or just a teacher who doesn't get my child or doesn't speak to my child in the way that motivates them in the work, or vice versa, that year is gone. And so the idea of having a team of educators who are able to sort of collectively own the experience of students creates a lot more flexibility in how that work happens.
That's really powerful, thinking about the time, experience for both students and teachers getting to work with more different types of adults in the room. Do you have a sense of what early evidence we have that helps us know this type of innovation is working for students and teachers? Are there any early examples you might be able to share?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say there's still so much to learn, because what strategic staffing models tend to do is bring together a lot of practices that we do have evidence that work, but then obviously there's a lot of different pieces of what makes an education system work, right? We always talk about how there are no silver bullets, and therefore there's no single thing that suddenly is going to change everything on its own. I would highlight two different models where research has been done at different stages of their development. So one is opportunity culture. We're coming out of public impact, where teachers join with multi-classroom leaders in teams and how they organize instruction. And they've had several studies done. Some of the most recent work is showing, coming out of Stanford, that the improvements in student performance have equated to an extra half year of learning on average with an educator in the MCL role, multi-classroom leader role. And so that's promising and exciting. And then the second piece I'd point to, again, and this is earlier days, but there's some really exciting work coming out of the Next Education Workforce Initiative at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College in Arizona State University. And again, still pretty early, and work happening mostly in Arizona, which is a context that is particularly challenging. But they're already starting to see early, what we call leading indicators of progress. So higher retention rates for teachers in the next education workforce models, which in a place like Arizona is huge because the turnover rates are very high and pay is very low. Teachers saying they're more likely to stick around in their career, they're more satisfied, and seeing higher evaluation ratings. And so all of those things tend to come together. The thing I would name about retention rates that is sometimes lost in this is the high level of turnover that we see, especially in our highest poverty schools, is completely unsustainable. It means that over the course of 3 or 4 years, half the staff in a school might turn over. And so for a family who's sending children to that school and seeing that discontinuity, that disruption happening for students who we value so much the adult relationships that they build. Obviously, retention is not the only be all end all outcome here, but there's so many benefits if we can manage what right now is unsustainable turnover of effective and potentially effective educators. And so the models that sort of deal with the underlying factors of isolation, of challenge to be successful, of lack of access to expertise, of lack of time, strategic staffing models tend to address those. And so you get sort of this double impact, if it works well, of both the retention piece and the daily improvement in instruction and outcomes when it works ideally.
I love that you're getting at both the evidence for these models, in particular, the ones that we know so far, and then also the work that they do to really address some of the underlying working conditions of what makes teaching really hard, what makes it a field that has had lower retention, and painting a picture of what that looks like in terms of the impact on a student and on their family. So that really resonates. And it sounds amazing. And I'm assuming that there are some real barriers to implementing this in schools. Can you share some of the biggest challenges that you foresee or that you've heard from some of the schools and districts that you work with?
For sure. And we have to name that every context is different, right? I'm sitting here in Massachusetts, like different from New York, different from Arizona, different from California, and in communities within those states. Having said that, there are some pretty common barriers that exist. So one, depending on the state where you're in, can be public policy or perceptions of public policy, right? So are there specific limitations, deliberate or not deliberate, in how you organize people and time in schools, right? And so even something like a class size maximum and a teacher of record policy are designed to ensure, right, with good intentions, that we're not sort of creating situations where educators can't do their work well and students aren't going to learn. At the same time, it really limits the flexibility to say, you know what, for part of the day, it might make sense for Ms. Fredston-Hermann to be driving instruction, or maybe we need a team of record rather than a teacher of record. So public policy is one that is out there. Related is depending on the community you're in, teacher contracts. Again, often with a positive intent of trying to structure things and not allow adults or students to be taken advantage of in any way, you end up with some pretty restrictive models. We can only have this much time for collaboration, and any more than that is outside the contract. Like that clearly is almost taking agency away from educators. The third thing I would say is district leaders' bandwidth to innovate is as constrained as it's been in a long time. It's just their jobs are incredibly challenging. The volume of what we're asking them to take on, the potential is huge. But doing work that requires you to see a future that you've never seen before, because as I alluded to at the beginning, like we've all seen school, we have a lot of data points in our head about how school works, is a really difficult thing. And that relates to the idea of like, so what's the technical support? What's the money? What's the access that you need in order to stimulate this kind of change? And that doesn't mean that the resource requirements have to be higher over time, right? Like we believe that you can do this work by reallocating existing resources, and we're seeing a lot of evidence of that. But to get rolling, you often need some startup costs, some time, some bandwidth, some support that is not always available. So being able to deal with those things creates a context in which we think we can accelerate innovation if we can address some of those barriers.
It's interesting to hear you talk about both some of the barriers and then some of the perceptions and vision for overcoming those barriers, and what does the strategy look like to address both of those. I'd love to hear a little bit about what is ERS and the organizations that you work with. How are you trying to address those barriers, both the ones in reality and the ones in perception, as well as any other pushback to innovating how we staff our classrooms?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of different angles on this. There's so many organizations that have engaged in the Coalition to Reimagine the Teaching Role and in your portfolio and others that are taking many approaches to this. I would highlight a couple of things that are truly important right now. One is more innovation, right? And more spreading of innovation and measuring the success of that innovation, right? We need to demonstrate, improve, and bring new ideas to the table, some of which are going to be models that we see, like an opportunity culture, next education workforce, some of which may be designed within a particular community, some of which may be driven by educators. some of which may not start with the idea of, quote, reimagining the teaching role, but that ultimately do essentially empower educators in ways that allow them to do that. I think about modern classrooms. I think about some of the work coming out of teacher-powered schools. I think of some of what's happening in other school design efforts. So innovation is a big part, like continuing to drive that. And we have a lot of players out there doing that. The second piece I would say is we have to show people the way, right? Like, as I keep saying, we have literally thousands and thousands of data points and examples in our heads of what school looks like. Overcoming that, not just for people like you and me, or principal or superintendent, but for a potential future educator, for people who are teaching now, for the people who influence future educators, their parents, right, and their friends and family. The idea that teaching can look different, and here's what it looks like, and not just because it's different, because it's actually a job that people say, oh yeah, that's the job I actually want. Like that's better. And we have data and we have examples of people who say, this is why the system is organized for my success, and I want it. It's just the exception, not the rule. So that's the second thing, is how do we show the way? A big part of the way we do that at ERS is by actually looking at the resource requirements and the resource shifts to say, not only can you do it, but you can do it within existing resource constraints if you're willing to make certain trade-offs and be thoughtful about all the resources you have. And then the third thing I would say is that the work, and this is really the broadest work, is about building the field. And you take a lot of inspiration in this work from other efforts to change not just public perception, but public reality. And that's where the work around policy, but also around, what does the research say? How do we stimulate more of the research that we need? What kind of support do we create? How are we measuring success? Can we have common ways of doing that? And so I think those three things together, and it's almost like they're concentric circles, right? The innovations themselves, the showing the way and doing the learning, and then building the field around it in order to create a context in which work can happen. We think that together can really be powerful over time.
I know I started this by saying we were going to talk mostly about innovation today, but you're also talking about evidence and you're also talking about growth and field building. It's exciting. I'm going to bring us out with one question that we're hoping to ask all of our guests. You might have answered some of this in what you shared about the vision for this work, but I'm curious, when you look ahead to the next decade in education, what makes you hopeful?
It's such a good question, because it's really challenging for all of us to some days to find that. For me, the idea that both the potential is there, the appetite is there, and nobody thinks the current structure and system works, right? There's very few people out there who are being like, teaching is great, everyone should do it, I love it, don't change a thing, and are actually having a common experience that is typical, right? And so change is going to start or be accelerated when there's this widespread, deeply felt agreement that what we have today is not okay, because that opens the door for so much of the innovation. And I think especially coming out of the last 4 years, but even before, like the appetite, the understanding, the drive to build something different, even for folks who don't know exactly what it could look like, I think is as strong as it's been in a very long time.
That's inspiring for me too. And the idea that we're aligning on the fact that something needs to change and you're helping create a vision for what that could look like. So thank you. That's leaving me a little bit more hopeful at the end of this conversation. So
Thanks, Jessica.
thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of Spotlight On, brought to you by Overdeck Family Foundation. We hope that you enjoyed. And if you'd like to be the first to know when our next episode drops, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and our foundation's newsletter. So thank you again, and goodbye for now.